In 1984, a decorated police sergeant signed on for her usual night shift and never came home. No wreck, no distress call, no goodbye, just one routine radio check, and then silence. 15 years later, when hikers stumbled across her rusted patrol car hidden deep in a dry Arizona gulch, they found something sealed inside, something no one was ever meant to see. And what it led to still haunts me today. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this have ever brushed past your own life. Every click helps bring another forgotten name back into the light. I'm Marlene Harlan. I was 27 when my sister Emily disappeared. Back then I worked front desk at the county courthouse day shift. Emily had the nights. We both lived on opposite sides of town, but we spoke nearly every day. That fall, we were planning a trip for Mom's birthday. We were going to drive out to Flagstaff, get her a hand-carved rocking chair she'd seen months earlier but wouldn't buy herself. Emily was 32, a sergeant with 12 years on the force. Folks respected her. She wasn't flashy or loud, just the kind of steady voice people trusted when something went wrong. I used to joke that if a coyote walked into a liquor store, she'd find a way to talk it down. Our town didn't see much action back then. Burglaries, the occasional domestic call, a few dust-ups at the quarry or the roadside bar off 89. Most nights I'd fall asleep knowing exactly where Emily was on patrol. Same route, same diner, coffee around 9, same wave to the old man who pumped gas on Southline. That's what made the week leading up to October 14th feel so strange. Emily wasn't acting different, not on the surface. But I remember one evening after dinner she paused before getting in her car. She looked over her shoulder and said, "I've got this feeling someone's been following me." She smiled when she said it like she didn't want me to worry. But I noticed how quickly she turned her keys, how she double-checked the rear view before pulling off. I didn't think much of it at the time. We'd grown up in a law enforcement family. Our dad was a deputy before he passed. We both knew how to brush things off. Still, there were signs. The day before her last shift, Emily asked if I remembered how to get out to Canyon Wash, the back roads past the quarry where the old mine trail splits. I said barely. "Why?" She just shrugged and said she might be covering that stretch for a bit. That struck me as odd. That wasn't part of her patrol. But when I asked, she changed the subject. On the morning of October 14th, she came by the courthouse to drop off a set of keys I'd left in her truck. She looked tired. Not exhausted, just drained. Like her thoughts were elsewhere. She gave me a quick hug, said she'd call tomorrow about the birthday plans, and that was it. That was the last time I saw her. That night she signed on at 6:00 p.m. as usual. Dry skies, no major incidents. Everything was normal until just before 10 when she radioed in to check a suspicious vehicle near Quarry Road. No request for backup, no urgency, just calm, clear protocol. Then nothing. No follow-up, no second call, no all clear. At first I didn't know anything was wrong. But at 6:43 the next morning, I walked into the station and the front desk officer wouldn't meet my eyes. The chief was already in uniform, but his hands were shaking. When I asked where Emily was, no one had an answer. They just kept saying she hadn't checked back in. And that's when the silence started. At first they said Emily hadn't checked back in. That was the phrase they kept using, soft non-committal, like maybe she'd just driven past her shift or stopped off somewhere unexpected. But the way they moved around the station that morning told me different. There was a stiffness in the air. Not panic, not yet, just a heavy kind of stillness. No one made eye contact. The chief, who'd known Emily since she was a rookie, kept rubbing his thumb over the edge of his badge like it might peel off. I asked again, had anyone tried calling her? Had they run the tracker on her unit? And finally someone admitted the truth. The last anyone heard from her was at 9:45 the night before. One radio call logged and confirmed, then nothing. That's when I asked to see the report. At first they said it wasn't ready, then they said it wasn't my place. So I went home and made 2 calls, one to the diner, where she always stopped for coffee, and one to the gas station on South Line. Both clerks said the same thing. Yeah, she came by. Yeah, everything seemed normal. That was the part that haunted me. Nothing had been wrong. There was no fight, no argument, no weird look exchanged. Just a normal night shift in the middle of October. And then, she was gone. By that evening, I drove back to the station and demanded to speak to whoever was coordinating the search. That's when I realized there wasn't one. Not really. A couple patrol officers had been sent along her usual route, and the dispatcher had tried her unit again around midnight. But that was it. No chopper, no dogs, no boots on the ground past the edge of town. They said they were waiting for jurisdictional clearance since the quarry road crossed into county land. I said she was one of their own. I said she could be out there needing help, and all the sergeant at the desk did was look down at his clipboard. I knew then something was deeply wrong. Emily's route was supposed to follow the North Loop and then cut back through 2 residential sectors. But the call she made suspicious vehicle Quarry Road was miles off that. That's what didn't make sense. She never went rogue. She didn't change routes unless someone told her to. And yet, when I got my hands on a copy of her patrol schedule, one of the junior clerks quietly passed it to me. There it was, the Quarry Road assignment. Printed, clean, no initials, no timestamp on the change. I asked who handled shift assignments that week, and the name I was given, Captain Lenham, had already put in for a transfer. Left the precinct 2 weeks later. Said he wanted to be closer to his wife's parents in Colorado. I never got a hold of him. The next few days moved like glue. Reporters called, then stopped. Officers stopped mentioning her name in the hall. People said they were doing everything they could, but I could see it no one was pushing. It was like they were afraid to look too close. And then came the second crack. A week after Emily vanished, a friend of hers from the academy, Darren Holt, called me out of the blue. Darren was young then, maybe 22, barely out of field training. He asked to meet off duty somewhere quiet. We sat in his truck outside a roadside diner just past county line. His hands shook when he passed me a torn page from a logbook. Q route 9 p.m., it read. Below that were 2 initials, HL. That's not your sister's handwriting, he said, but it's her shift. I asked what it meant, and he shook his head. Don't ask that out loud. I asked him if he saw her that night. He hesitated, then said he'd been patrolling near the quarry around 10:30 and spotted taillights turning into the brush. Radioed it in. Dispatch said no units were assigned there. He started to follow, but his training officer told him to let it go. She didn't deserve what happened, he said. That was the last time I heard from him. Darren resigned a week later. I took the log page home and stared at it for hours. Q route? I didn't know what it meant then, but it wasn't a standard route. Not for our town. I started making calls, writing letters, filing formal requests to access case notes. Most went unanswered. One clerk sent a polite denial. Another envelope came back with a sticky note that said, "Stop. Let it be." And then, a full year after the night Emily disappeared, someone came through the cracks. Gloria Fenton had been a dispatcher for almost 25 years. She'd retired in '91, moved south. She heard about the case on a late-night radio segment and reached out. We met at her kitchen table over a pot of weak coffee. She said she remembered Emily's final shift vividly. She'd been the one to log the suspicious vehicle call. It wasn't frantic, she told me. Her voice was calm. Quarry Road, possible 1066. Solo approach. I asked if that was in the official recording. Gloria looked me in the eye and said no. That section of the tape was gone. Erased. Not lost, not damaged cut. And whoever did it knew what they were doing. She'd kept a personal copy on cassette just in case. I listened to it in her living room. My sister's voice came through steady and measured. No fear, no hesitation, just protocol. And then silence. When I brought this to the department, they dismissed it, said it was incomplete, not admissible. When I asked why the official archives didn't match, they shrugged. I was told not to interfere with active files, but it was already too late for that. Late one night, a year later, I got a call. The voice was low, shaking. A man. I couldn't place him. "You're still looking for her?" he asked. I said yes. He paused, then whispered, "North Gully, South Ridge Line, below the old service road," and the line went dead. I called the station immediately. A single unit was dispatched. Nothing found. No follow-up. The report was filed as a false lead. 3 months later, the area was cleared and flattened for off-road vehicle training. The land's shape, its soil, its contours, all of it lost. That call still rattles around in my head, because whoever it was knew I hadn't given up, knew where I lived, knew I'd act on it. Which meant they weren't warning me. They were watching. And by then, I'd started to wonder, who else was? I tried going through the front door, filing requests, setting meetings, following proper channels, but it got me nowhere. The official stance was that Emily's disappearance was an open case and therefore confidential. I wasn't family enough to access anything useful, and the little I was given had entire paragraphs blacked out or misfiled. Most of the officers who'd been on duty that night said the same thing almost word for word. They didn't recall anything unusual. One even told me straight out, "I've moved on, you should too." But I hadn't moved on. I couldn't. Especially not after that anonymous call about the ridge. Especially not after watching them bulldoze the exact stretch of land where I was told to look. That moment hardened something in me. I realized if answers were going to come, they wouldn't come from above. I'd have to start pulling the thread myself. I went back to the torn log page Darren had handed me in his truck. Q wrote 9 p.m., initials HL. It wasn't much, but it didn't feel random. I kept coming back to those letters, and finally I remembered something. HL matched the initials of Captain Lenham, the same man who'd authorized the patrol shift change, and then transferred out right after Emily vanished. I tried contacting him, but his new department said he was no longer active, no forwarding number. When I asked if he'd ever mentioned the Harlan case, the woman on the line went quiet, then told me she needed to transfer me. I was put on hold for 6 minutes, then disconnected. By the end of that year, I was sending letters to anyone who might listen, state officials, retired reporters, even a few old colleagues from the courthouse who'd since moved on to other agencies. I thought about hiring a lawyer, but didn't have the money. Instead, I filed under the Freedom of Information Act twice. Both were denied. Reason, ongoing investigation. But not everyone shut me out. One afternoon in early '92, I got a handwritten note slipped under my apartment door. No envelope, just 6 words written in block letters. She said someone was watching her. It wasn't signed. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't told anyone about that conversation Emily and I had on the sidewalk, the one where she brushed off being followed. Either someone had overheard it back then, or they were watching me now too. That same month, I got a call from a woman named Gloria Reyes. She used to work dispatch before moving out of state. Said she'd heard through someone in the retirement union that I was still looking into Emily's case. She told me she had something I needed to hear, and a few days later, I made the 4-hour drive to her new place near Sedona. Gloria was in her late 60s, sharp-eyed, and didn't waste time. She set a small tape recorder on the kitchen table and pressed play. It was the original radio transmission from the night Emily disappeared. Not the archived version the department had released to the public. This was something Gloria had copied herself just in case. The sound was grainy, but there was no mistaking my sister's voice. Calm. Controlled. Unit 57 checking suspicious vehicle Quarry Road. No backup needed, will advise. That was it. Clean, professional. No trace of fear. Gloria said it had always bothered her that this portion was missing from the official logs. When she'd asked about it at the time, a supervisor told her not to worry, it had been a glitch. But she didn't believe that then, and neither did I now. Someone had removed it on purpose. I brought the tape to the department. They dismissed it as unauthenticated. Anyone could have recorded that, the investigator said. I asked if they'd at least compare it to the dispatch tapes on file. He said those records had been compromised in a system update years earlier. When I asked for clarification, he told me, "That's not something we're required to disclose." From there, things got quieter. A little too quiet. Calls stopped being returned. I'd show up for scheduled appointments and be told there was no record of them. People I'd known for years in town suddenly acted like I was asking for something I didn't deserve to know. I was starting to understand that this wasn't just about negligence or budget cuts. It felt like someone wanted the whole thing to fade out, and most folks were fine letting it happen. Then in late '94, I got another phone call. Different voice this time. Older, a little more steady. "If you're serious about this," he said, "check the records from the South District logs that week. The names don't match." I asked who I was speaking to, but he hung up. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I drove to the records office and asked for copies of the duty logs for the entire week of October 14th, 1984. Not just Emily's shift, but all officers in the county. What I found nearly made my knees buckle. 2 officers listed as riding along that night weren't from our town. In fact, they weren't listed in any official employee directory I had access to. Just last names, badge numbers, and a vague assignment code joint tasking. No department name, no initials, no purpose. I flagged it with the clerk, but he said the original hard copies had been destroyed in a basement flood back in '89. All that remained were summaries, and those were restricted. I went home and laid out every report I'd collected so far, radio logs, shift, rosters, internal memos, and the tape from Gloria. I ran string between them like people do in crime shows. Not because I thought it would solve anything, but because I needed to see it all in one place. That's when I noticed a receipt tucked behind a folder. It was from a gas station just off Highway 17. Time-stamped 7:42 p.m. the night Emily disappeared, and signed in her handwriting. The problem: her last radio transmission had come at 7:35 from a location miles away. Either the dispatch log was wrong, or the timeline had been tampered with. I drove out to that gas station. It had changed hands a few times, but one of the older employees still worked in the back doing stock. He didn't remember Emily by name, but when I showed him her photo, he said, "Yeah, I remember her. She stood near the payphone for a long time. Looked like she wanted to make a call, but never did. I asked if there were cameras." He shook his head. Not back then. But the way he said it made me think there might have been a record once, just not anymore. A few weeks later, I pulled a phone record from that same night. The call from the payphone had gone to an unlisted number tied to a regional DEA field office. Emily had never worked with the DEA. She wasn't assigned to anything federal. So why would she contact them? I tried to reach someone from that office, but most had moved on. Finally, a retired agent called me back, said he remembered hearing whispers of a local sergeant poking around a location she wasn't supposed to be near. "Operation Bridgeway," he muttered. I asked what that was. He just said, "She found something she wasn't supposed to. That's why she disappeared." I pressed him. I needed to know what she found, but all he said was, she wasn't taken for what she did. She was taken for what she knew. And then he hung up. After that call ended, I just sat there. I didn't press redial, didn't make another call, didn't speak. Just listened to the quiet hum of the line after he hung up. She was taken for what she knew. That's what he said. I wrote it down slowly, like the act of writing it might make it more real. The next morning, I went into work and cleared out my desk. I told the clerk I needed extended leave, and when he asked if everything was all right, I told him I was fine. I wasn't. But I didn't expect anyone to ask again. For the next several weeks, I stopped trying to convince anyone of anything. I stopped pushing press releases, stopped calling the department, stopped showing up at city meetings with my folder full of copies. It wasn't surrender. It was something quieter. I needed time to breathe inside the silence that had wrapped around this story, because somewhere in that silence, I started to notice what had been there all along, how easily people had adjusted to her absence. That's what shook me more than anything. Not that Emily was gone, but that the world had learned to carry on without asking where she went. I kept everything on my kitchen table. Tapes, notes, maps, receipts, the original logbook page from Darren, a copy of the personnel roster for the week she vanished. At night, I'd sit in the dark with a cup of tea and just look at the mess of it. Not to solve it, but to remember that it was real, that this had happened, and that several someones had helped make it disappear. I think the turning point came when I stopped trying to get the truth out into the open and started thinking about what it would mean to just find it for myself. I wasn't trying to bring anyone down. I didn't have a grand plan. I just needed to see it clearly, even if it meant being the only one who did. It was sometime in early spring of '95 when I started writing down every location Emily had ever mentioned outside of workplaces she liked to go to think to be alone. Most of them were parks, stretches of desert back roads that lake up past Bellevue. But one stuck with me, a small wooden bridge about an hour from town. She'd mentioned it twice in passing once after a funeral. Said she liked to drive out there when her head was too full. I'd never been. I wasn't even sure how to get there. But I remembered the sketch. It was one of the last pieces of evidence I'd come across. Tucked inside a folder in the box from Gloria, the retired dispatcher. A hand-drawn scene, 3 figures near a narrow bridge. One with a badge, the other 2 without. A vehicle just barely visible in the corner. In Emily's handwriting, 2 WKs prior. That was it. I made the drive out to the area. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. No map, no marker. Just a hunch. It took me most of the afternoon, but I found the bridge. Low single lane, no guardrails. The wood creaked under my weight when I stepped out of the car. I walked slowly along the edge, following the sketch in my hand, comparing it to the angles around me. And there, tucked into the concrete base of the north pillar, nearly hidden by overgrowth, I found it. Scratched into the stone in uneven letters, EJ. I saw you. The world went quiet. No cars, no birds, no wind. Just the sound of my own breath, shallow and sudden. I didn't know what it meant, whether Emily wrote it or someone else, but it wasn't graffiti. It wasn't idle. It was placed. It was meant to last. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 3 letters. EJ, Emily Jane. And beneath it, I saw you. Who saw her? And more importantly, what did they see? I started combing through the last of the physical files I had, the ones I'd been too tired to organize. In a folder mislabeled under a traffic stop from '83, I found a photograph. Black and white, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed Emily standing near a car outside a diner parking lot. Her head turned slightly, like she was reacting to something behind her. Scribbled on the back, "She knows too much," watching her closely. Initials, CB. I had no idea who CB was, and the note gave no context. But there was a fingerprint smudge on the corner. I had it analyzed at a private lab in Phoenix. They ran it through their limited archive and matched it to a former federal agent named Carl Bowden, deceased. Ruled a suicide in '99. No foul play. But in the months before his death, there were whispers of disciplinary disputes, misfiled records, and unofficial payouts tied to something, though the source wouldn't say what. The story vanished when he did. If Bowden was watching Emily, and someone knew it, then this wasn't about a local grievance. It had reach. Layers. I thought again about Operation Bridgeway. About the unlisted DEA call. About the photo of Emily receiving something at that diner. I was chasing pieces of a puzzle no one wanted completed. Then came the note. It arrived in a manila envelope, no return address. Folded inside was a single sheet of paper and an old photo. The paper read, "Keep going, but carefully. Some trails only look cold." The photo was time-stamped 9:12 p.m. the night Emily vanished. She was at a gas station, standing near the payphone. But in the background, leaning against a black sedan, was a man in a jacket I'd seen before. He'd been at the town hall meeting the year prior when I spoke out about reopening her case. Stood in the back, arms folded, didn't take notes, didn't speak. I hadn't seen him since. And now here he was 15 years earlier in the same clothes, same posture, just watching. I didn't know who he was. Still don't. But I know he was real. I know he was watching her just like he watched me. And if he was willing to be seen in both photos, he wasn't trying to stay invisible. He was leaving a message, not for everyone, just for the ones still looking. And by then I understood there weren't many of us left. In the weeks after that photograph showed up, the one with the man in the jacket just standing behind Emily like he'd been waiting for something, I started going back through everything again. But this time, instead of reading reports or chasing phone numbers, I paid attention to the small things. Scraps. Scribbled notes I'd once dismissed. I was in the middle of sorting an old envelope from the early case files when I found it tucked between transcripts from a ride-along interview and a faded Xerox of the shift schedule. A folded piece of paper, water-stained at the corner but still legible. It was a service receipt from a local auto garage dated September 10th, 1984. The signature was Emily's. Written in the notes section just below where she'd signed off on a brake inspection were 7 small words. "Check again if anything ever happens." I don't know how I missed it before. I called the garage first thing the next morning, hoping someone might remember. The name on the ticket was Pike Auto, and when the phone picked up, I got an older man on the other end who introduced himself as Walter. I asked if he'd worked there in the 80s. He said he had. I asked if he remembered servicing a patrol car around that time, one that came in for brake concerns. There was a pause. Then he said, "She had brown hair, real calm voice." I told him yes. He said he'd checked her brakes twice, and that she'd seemed nervous the second time, asked him to look close at the lines. Said she was hearing something off. He didn't find anything wrong. But she told him, "If anything ever happens to me, look at this car first." He said he'd waited for someone to come asking all these years, but no one ever had. Not once. That night I drove out to his property. He still had his old invoice pad, the one with carbon copies. Emily's service slip was still tucked inside. He handed it to me with both hands like it was something sacred. "I never knew if I should keep it," he said. "But I couldn't throw it away either." I asked if he'd ever shared it with the department. He looked at me like I'd asked something foolish. "Would you?" 2 days later, I requested access to the cruiser maintenance logs from the precinct. The records clerk told me the box had been damaged in a small electrical fire back in '91. When I asked which files had been lost, he shrugged and said, "Mostly traffic stop logs, some personnel files." But when I pressed for specifics, he pulled out a list. Emily's name was on it, along with a few others connected to her division. I asked to see the report from the fire. He said there wasn't one, just a notation. No injuries, minor damage, case closed. When I asked who handled cleanup, he flipped the page and said storage was cleared by Doyle. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, thanked him, and walked out. That night I drove past the river, the same spot where that anonymous caller had told me to search years earlier, where they'd bulldozed the gully and paved it over for off-road training. I pulled off the shoulder and sat there for a while, not looking for anything, just trying to understand how something could disappear so completely and still leave behind this many fingerprints. I don't mean that literally. I mean every time I got close, I found another sign someone had already been there, not searching, erasing. The following week, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting looked familiar. Inside was a single photograph. Emily at a gas station. Timestamped October 14th, 1984, 9:30 p.m. Her last shift. She's standing near the front window, her head turned toward the side of the building, and just barely visible in the background near the edge of the frame is that same black sedan. Same dent near the back tire. Same shape I'd seen before. My hands started shaking before I even registered why. It wasn't just the car. There was a person in the driver's seat. His face was in shadow, but the outline of the jaw, the cut of the uniform, it looked like someone I recognized. I called in a favor from an old friend in records, someone I used to work with at the courthouse who still had access to personnel files. I didn't ask her to pull anything sensitive, just a single shift roster from that night. I said I wanted to check something. She faxed me a copy the next morning. At the bottom of the second page, I found it. Officer Kenneth Doyle, badge number 7431, logged as present on the initial search team for the Harlan disappearance. I didn't remember seeing his name in the early weeks. I went back through the press coverage. His name was never quoted, never listed in any of the official recaps. And yet, there he was, buried in the rosters. Promoted quietly 2 years later. No commendation, no ceremony. Just moved up and out of missing persons into narcotics. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't send the photo to the press. I just kept digging. The final piece of the puzzle came from someone I never expected. A man named Delroy. I'd seen his name once before mentioned in a supplemental case note from 1984. A homeless witness who claimed he'd seen a woman arguing with a man near the cliffs the night she disappeared. His statement had been dismissed as unreliable due to intoxication. But I found him, still living in the same neighborhood, still remembering. I brought a copy of Emily's photo. He looked at it for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That's her. She was scared. I remember." I asked if he remembered the man. He said he did. I showed him a few photos, department portraits. When he got to Doyle, he tapped the photo once and whispered, "That's him." He also said he'd seen that same man come back a few weeks later alone. Said he tossed something into the water near the edge of the bend and then drove off. No badge, no markings. Just the same car, same jacket, same stillness. I thanked Delroy and left him a warm meal and my number. Then I started making calls. Took a few weeks, but eventually I found a private dive team willing to help. I told them we were looking for metal. Maybe a discarded weapon? Maybe nothing. I didn't mention the name. Didn't tell them who we were searching for. The riverbed was deeper than it looked, silted over in places. But 12 feet down they found something. A duffel bag, chained shut, waterlogged and sealed tight. Inside was a rusted handgun, a department badge, 7431, and a half-destroyed notebook. The ink had bled through most of the pages, but one sentence remained clear enough to read. "If I disappear, this man is why." Signed E. Harlan. And for the first time in 15 years, I sat perfectly still, not from shock, not from grief, but because the silence had finally shifted. Something had made its way back up from the bottom. And it wasn't just hers anymore. When I handed over the duffel bag and the soaked badge to the state investigator's office, I thought naively that we were finally past the point of silence. It was evidence. Physical, tangible. A weapon, a notebook, a badge number scratched through like someone didn't want it recognized. Emily's handwriting, barely legible, still clinging to paper that had spent over a decade in a riverbed. I expected something to happen. Maybe not handcuffs or indictments, but at least a real acknowledgement. Instead, I got a phone call 2 weeks later from a junior officer who told me flatly that the state was declining to open a formal investigation. Insufficient criminal evidence, he said, as if the bag hadn't existed, as if the water damage meant the truth no longer counted. I remember leaning against the kitchen counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerator as he spoke, and realizing that whoever was protecting this story, whatever it really was, they were still one step ahead. And they weren't finished. I asked the officer gently if they'd spoken to Kenneth Doyle before coming to that conclusion. He paused, then said Doyle had quietly retired 2 months earlier. No forwarding address, no final statement, just gone, moved out of state. It wasn't a cover-up that screamed and slammed doors. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of chairs pushed back just before the music ends. I sat with that silence for days, waiting to feel angry or relieved or something in between. But I didn't feel much of anything, just a hollow sort of knowing. I'd always believed there was more than one person involved, more than one name. The bag was proof of that, if nothing else. I called a retired officer I trusted, someone who'd worked with Emily back in the early years. He didn't say much at first. I could tell he was weighing every word, even with the phone pressed close. But when I asked him plainly if he remembered Emily mentioning anywhere private somewhere she could go and not be followed, his tone changed. She had a place, he said. Cabin up by Mirror Ridge, belonged to her uncle's side. I don't know if she used it much, but she kept a key on her second ring. That was the first I'd ever heard of it. I thanked him and hung up, heart pounding. Mirror Ridge was only 20 minutes from where Emily's patrol car had been found. I checked every file I had. No mention of a cabin, no address, no search conducted, nothing. So I drove out there myself, no plan, no flashlight, just the name and the direction. The road was old and cracked, partly washed out in places. It curved through tree cover so thick the sun barely filtered through. But the cabin was there. Faded wood window boards, soft from age roof, slumped to one side. It looked forgotten, like time had been waiting for someone to find it again. Inside it was empty. Mostly. Dust on the shelves, dry pine needles across the floor. I stepped carefully, listening for anything beneath my feet. It wasn't until I moved the worn rug in the center of the room that I saw the trapdoor. The edges were nearly flush with the floor, the handle rusted but intact. I paused before lifting it, then pulled. A damp, musty cold came rising up from below. I aimed my phone's flashlight into the space just enough to see wooden steps descending into stone. I went down. The crawl space was narrow, maybe 5 feet wide, damp along the base cobwebs strung low like wires. At the far end, scrawled across one stone wall, were 3 words scratched in uneven lines. I'm still here. My breath caught. There was no body, no bones. But there was a small scrap of faded cloth stuck to the jagged stone. Navy blue with the same shoulder stitch pattern I remembered from Emily's uniform jacket. I stepped backward, heart beating in my ears, and climbed out without touching anything else. I didn't call the department. I couldn't trust what they'd do with it. Instead, I filed an anonymous tip. Gave them the coordinates, said I'd found the cabin while hiking. They showed up 2 days later with a forensic team and sealed off the property. A week passed. I called in pretending to be a local reporter and was told there were no confirmed remains, just items of interest. But I already knew what they'd found. I knew the handwriting was hers. I'd seen her write, "I'm still here," once years earlier on a postcard from basic training. I went home and mapped out the timeline again on my kitchen wall. Every year, every name, every stretch of silence. The discovery of her patrol car in 1999. The badge recovered from the river. The notebook. Now the cabin. It felt like pieces rising up in order, like something unfinished was trying to make itself known. But the more I looked at the gaps, the more I saw something else. A space between 1985 and 1990 where Emily wasn't just missing, she was invisible. No confirmed sightings, no leads, nothing. And then, almost quietly, I found something else. Over those 5 years, 5 women disappeared from nearby counties. 1 in 1986, 2 in 87, 1 each in 88 and 89. All between the ages of 28 and 35. All filed as runaways or domestic disputes. None of them received extended press coverage. None of them were connected. Except one thing. Each initial police report listed the same investigator on the scene. Kenneth Doyle. I stared at that name for hours. The badge number I'd seen scratched on the metal plate. The same face that Delroy had identified near the cliffs. The same man who had quietly removed himself from the department and vanished before the state could act. I brought this to a journalist contact, someone who had once tried to cover internal corruption but had been stonewalled. He confirmed what I already suspected. Doyle had been listed on active duty through 2002 but hadn't logged a field report in over a decade, and no one could explain why. That night I got a call from a blocked number. I let it ring twice before answering. The voice was masked, digitally scrambled, but it was a man. All he said was, "Some doors aren't meant to open." Then silence. The call was traced to a tower 3 blocks from the old precinct building. That was confirmation enough. I passed everything I had to a Senate aide who had shown interest after the duffel bag was found. She said there'd be a quiet review, promised to keep me in the loop. But over the next month, my draft article was rejected from 2 different outlets. My email accounts were breached. The forensic summary from the cabin disappeared from the shared archive. I stopped receiving updates. And then one night I got a text from an unknown number. No words, just an image. A photo of the cabin, burning, flames already through the roof. The angle was close personal, like the person taking it had been waiting for the right moment. I never found out who sent it, but I knew what it meant. Someone had waited 15 years for the evidence to stay buried. Now they were making sure it burned. But silence doesn't end a story. It just leaves space for something else to take root. And this story, it wasn't finished. Not even close. When the cabin burned, I told myself it was the end of a chapter, not the story. But deep down, I knew what it meant. Someone was tying off loose ends fast, and they'd already proven they had no problem waiting years to do it. The flames didn't just erase physical evidence, they severed whatever was left of the last place Emily might have felt safe. It was personal, deliberate. And it forced me to reckon with a new possibility. This might not have started as a cover-up, but by now it had become one. Whether or not Emily had been silenced for what she saw, someone was making sure no one else ever understood it. I kept my head down, said little, let the silence build back around me. I knew better than to call attention to myself after that. A month went by, then 2. And just when I thought things had cooled, I came home to a manila envelope sitting flat on my front stoop. No stamp, no tape, just placed there quietly. Inside was a note. Read carefully. Beneath it, a stack of photocopied pages yellowed at the edges. Some smeared, others redacted so heavily it looked like someone had taken a paintbrush to them. But in the top right corner of every page, faint, barely visible, was the same rubber-stamped name, Sergeant Emily Harlan. Official. I laid them out across my table and began scanning each one slowly. There were old interview transcripts, patrol notes, radio dispatch summaries. Some of it matched the records I'd already seen or tried to get, but some of it didn't. One document stood out immediately. Dated July 1986, 2 full years after Emily had vanished. The header read, "Protective Custody Transfer, Pending Review." I read that phrase over and over, not sure what to make of it. Below in typewritten lines was a brief evaluation. Subject shows signs of trauma. Threat level high. Recommend relocation. Awaiting coordination with U.S. Marshals Division. No attached case number. No follow-up report. Just that. I called the marshal's office listed in the footer. Spoke to 3 different people. None had ever heard of a transfer under Emily's name. One clerk offered to check under aliases but came back empty. I faxed over the document. They said it looked legitimate but wasn't in any of their systems. No digital trace, no archive file. It was as if someone had drafted it, but never filed it. That's when the question hit me: was Emily alive even briefly after she disappeared? And if she was, who was she being protected from? There was no answer waiting. Only more layers. I thought about the words scratched into the cabin wall. I'm still here. and whether they were a warning or a trace. Maybe both. In the weeks that followed, I drove back out to the bluff where they'd found her patrol car. The vegetation had started reclaiming the ground. Tall weeds had pushed through cracks in the soil, and the tree line was thicker than I remembered. There was no crime scene tape, no marker, just a faint hollow in the earth where her cruiser had rested. The wind carried a faint metallic tang like rust warming under the sun. Each year since that car was found, someone had left fresh lilies at the edge of the cliff. No card, no note, always the same kind. White petals tinged faintly pink at the tips. I'd never seen who brought them, but they always appeared within a few days of October 14th. This year was no different. I arrived early one morning and found them placed gently on the rock shelf, neatly arranged stem ends wrapped in twine. Someone else remembered. Someone else was still watching. In 2005, a plaque appeared at a park across town mounted beneath an oak tree that overlooked the walking path near the old precinct. It was simple. Brass plate bolted to a stone base. No city seal, no dedication. Just a name, Sergeant Emily Harlan, 1952 to unknown. And beneath it, one line, "You never walked alone." When I called the Parks Department to ask who'd authorized it, no one could give me a name. The city clerk said it wasn't filed. The precinct said they hadn't installed it, but someone had. I visited it often, left a small candle some evenings, just to let her know she wasn't forgotten. One afternoon I found a slip of paper tucked behind the plaque. The ink had smudged from weather, but it was still readable. It said, "Truth buried is still truth." But it waits. No signature. But the paper was cut in the same size and texture as the old department memo pads, the kind they used back in the 80s. I kept it tucked into my folder with the other clippings. Later that fall, another envelope arrived. This one was older brittle with age sealed in a clear plastic sleeve. Inside were photocopies of case summaries, many blacked out or missing entire sections. But one entry caught my attention. A statement labeled simply, "Interview Notes, E.H., dated June 1986, 6 months before the protective custody document. There was no audio, no transcript header, just scribbled remarks from someone interviewing her. In the margin, a faint note. She's scared, but she knows where the box is. I didn't know what that meant at first. But then I remembered something. Back when we were kids, Emily kept a wooden box in our parents' basement. She'd line it with newspaper and store little things inside junk she thought might be useful someday. She stopped using it after high school, but I'd always assumed it was thrown out. I called the current owner of the old house, explained who I was, and asked if I could stop by to look for something. They agreed. When I got there, I found the basement mostly cleared out. New water heater, painted walls, no signs of the old shelves. But tucked behind the utility panel, wedged under a pipe bracket, was the box. It looked the same brass hinges, same scratch in the lid. I opened it slowly. On top were childhood keepsakes, old buttons, a watch without hands, a packet of pressed flowers. But underneath, in a false bottom she'd carved into the lining, was something else. A small cassette tape labeled only "Don't Trust the Badge." I brought it home and found an old player that still worked. The audio was faint, a little warped, but the voice was hers. She sounded tired, measured, not panicked, but focused. "If anything happens to me, I've copied everything and hidden the rest. I'm scared, but I can't walk away. If someone's hearing this, look for the badge with the scratch." That line stopped me. I thought of the one recovered from the River 7431 with a deep gouge across the number. She went on listing badge numbers, locations, dates. All in that calm, methodical tone she always used when she didn't want her nerves to show. On the second tape, her voice dropped lower. "I've seen the same car twice now. Black sedan. Same plates. Same man. They know I'm watching." There was a pause, then the final words, If you're hearing this, they're close. Don't wait too long. And then silence. I sat in the dark and let the tape run out. I didn't move, didn't speak, just let it end. I hadn't heard her voice in over 20 years. And even though the recording was grainy, even though time had worn down the edges, there was no doubt who it was. She'd known. She'd prepared for this. And she'd left a trail just enough to follow, but never too much to expose someone else. I rewound the tape, played the ending again. They're close. Don't wait too long. And for the first time in all those years, I wasn't sure if she meant them or me. The hardest part wasn't hearing her voice again. It was realizing how much she'd held back to protect people like me. That cassette, her warning, her confession, wasn't just a trail of evidence. It was a kind of will. And for weeks after I found it, I couldn't decide whether I owed her silence or something louder. I kept the tapes hidden in a fireproof lockbox, brought in an old contact I trusted from out of state. Someone who'd worked with internal affairs in the 90s. He didn't ask too many questions, just listened. Then he nodded once and said, "You're going to need help from the inside." Quiet help. That's how we brought in Detective Laura Mendel, retired but still sharp. She'd left the department in 2003, just shy of 30 years on the force. She didn't owe anyone favors anymore. When I played the tape for her, she went still. Then she asked me to rewind it. After a long silence, she said she'd heard whispers about a protection request being shredded years ago, something about a female officer and a list of badge numbers that couldn't be explained. She'd never been able to pin it down, said she thought it was just department gossip. But now, she said it felt like something had always been festering beneath the surface, and this was the infection finally breaking open. Laura had one condition. If she helped bring this forward, it had to be through official channels. No leaks, no documentaries, just the law. I agreed. We met in quiet places, cemeteries, parking lots after closing. She started reviewing the case log numbers from the tape, cross-referencing them with the internal archives she still had access to through her pension clearance. Most of the badge numbers Emily mentioned were dead ends, either retired or reassigned. But one came up flagged 7431, the same number found etched and scratched on the badge buried under the bridge. It belonged to a patrolman named Vincent McGrath, a man who'd resigned in 1984 after a suspension for conduct unbecoming. No public charges, no press. Just walked off the job and vanished from the records. Laura found an old personnel file with a partial address. A trailer park 3 counties over. The lot had since been paved over and converted into a storage facility. We drove out there together. It was raining. I remember that because the air smelled like rust and wet concrete. The storage manager let us look at the archived lease records. McGrath's name was there, tied to Unit C-17, but the name scratched below it in the margin, faint, written in pencil, was Harlan. No first name, no context. Just that. The unit had been cleared out years ago after non-payment, but the clerk said some contents had been boxed and turned over to county holding. Old policy. We followed the trail through dusty municipal buildings and signed more paperwork than I can remember. Eventually, we were led to a crate the size of a small dresser. Inside were mostly trash, mildewed phone books, a cracked TV screen, tools without cords. But at the bottom was a single sealed envelope marked "Confidential Transfer. Do not process without chain of custody." Laura signed for it. Her hands were shaking. Back at her kitchen table, we opened it together. The first page was a faded intake form from 1986. The name at the top was redacted, but the birth date and ID photo matched Emily. It listed her status as protective witness, federal oversight pending. The next few pages were medical evaluations notes about stress, paranoia, dehydration. The attending physician had scribbled a single line in the margin. She refuses to name who she saw. Says the badge scratch is enough. Another form was clipped behind that. A transfer order to a secure holding facility in Missouri. but the form was never signed, just left blank beneath the words, "Officer Escort Authorization Required." Laura leaned back in her chair and stared at nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Someone stopped this before it ever got off the ground." I asked if there was any way to track where she'd gone after that. Laura shook her head. Not without pulling teeth. The next day, we contacted a former assistant U.S. attorney who'd worked corruption cases in the 80s. He was cautious, but agreed to meet. When we laid out the documents and the tape, he went very still. He said he remembered rumors of a badge-sharing ring, a network of patrolmen and one lieutenant who were allegedly running protection for a series of backdoor operations. Illegal seizures, evidence suppression, even facilitating a few disappearances when things got messy. Nothing ever stuck. Most of the men involved either transferred quietly retired early or vanished off paper. He said the word back then was that a young officer had stumbled across a car swap involving one of the internal affairs lieutenants and had tried to report it anonymously. The reports were shredded. The car disappeared. And she did too. He agreed to reopen what he could informally and said if more documentation surfaced, he'd push it upward. But the odds were slim. Too many years. Too many sealed doors. A week later, Laura called me, said I needed to come see her in person. She had something. When I arrived, she handed me a copy of a property transfer deed from 1987. The signature was almost illegible, but the co-signer's name was typed clearly, Emily Harlan. The property was listed under a trust name buried under a shell company. A small cabin in the Ozarks. She'd owned it. The one that burned. Emily had owned it all along. We stood in silence for a long time listening to the refrigerator hum. Laura finally said, if she made it that far, she probably knew she wouldn't last. But she bought herself time. We stared at the deed. No one had ever mentioned that in the reports, because it had never been connected to her officially. But someone had known someone had cared enough to buy that place under the radar. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was someone helping her. Either way, someone else had walked through those woods, carried flowers to that cliffside every year, and left notes behind plaques with no signatures. The silence had stretched for decades, but it had never been empty. That night, I played the tape one more time, just to hear her voice, and I wrote down every badge number, every plate, every name she'd said. We weren't finished. We were just getting close enough to touch the lock. I never found her body. That's what people ask first, even if they don't say it out loud. They want to know if there was a grave, a marker, something official that lets the story sit neatly in their minds. But the truth is, we never found Emily. Not her remains. Not her badge. Just the trail she left behind for people like me, just enough to say I didn't vanish. I was erased. I think that's what she wanted most of all. To be remembered as real. The cabin site is gone now, leveled after the fire. The county paved over the area last spring, made it part of a wildlife survey route. But the cliff is still there with the view she must have stood in front of 100 times. I went back once more after it all wrapped up. Left no flowers, just stood in silence. That's how you honor someone like her. You don't speak for them. You listen for what's still echoing. Laura Mendel passed last year. Heart failure. She'd stayed sharp until the end, still filing paperwork, still digging when she could. Before she went, she mailed me a folder, unmarked, no note inside. Just one last set of documents, a full chain of custody request from 1984, requesting a badge transfer for temporary reassignment. The author was listed as Lieutenant Kenneth Doyle. The reason badge unavailable pending recovery. I sat there for a long time holding the page. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it was a piece of the puzzle that no one had ever wanted to finish. They reopened the internal review board after we submitted everything, quietly without press. It wasn't about headlines. Most of the men involved were either dead or long retired. But the badge numbers were finally acknowledged. Some commendations were quietly revoked. and Emily Raines's name was restored in the database, not as missing, not as retired, as fallen. That was all we asked for. That was all she'd been denied. Her sister Marlene never remarried. She lives in Flagstaff now. Quiet life. We talk sometimes. She sends postcards with pictures of birds she sees from her back porch. Once she sent a photo of a note she found tucked behind an old family Bible. Said she hadn't seen it in decades. It was just a line scribbled in blue ink. Said, "They told me to stay quiet, so I wrote it down instead." The handwriting matched Emily's. I think about her a lot. Not just what she suffered, but what she tried to do in spite of it. She didn't vanish into nothing. She fought quietly, stubbornly, and she left a trail for others to follow. Maybe that's the best some people can do. Not break the system, but mark the weak spots. Leave enough signs so the next person sees where not to step. If you're still listening and something in this story stayed with you, consider sharing it. Not for numbers, not for noise, just so her name doesn't vanish again. Emily Raines, officer, sister, witness, still here,